don't know about the good things. I only know about the heartache and pain. 'Cause when you love me, girl, you treated me right, made me cry, made me blue. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now I'm through. I just know about the miseries. That's all you offered with your love. Now I'm gone. I'm gone and left for good. So baby, you got what you give like you should. Now I'm through. 'Cause you've been running around with every other guy in town, taking me for a ride. But now I'm back. I'm gonna let you know you're wrong now, baby. I'm gonna hurt your
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. How y'all doing? Good, good. Do I need to stay near the microphone for that? I'm used to moving around when I lecture, but I will try to. I will try. Yeah, then I feel like a nightclub entertainer, which sometimes my students. Okay, I'll try to do this a different way. Yeah. Well, good afternoon. I'm David Lewis. If you're here for the sex therapy session, that's next week, and I'm sorry, you'll have to come back. I'm here to talk about really history, what history is. And of course, we all know history is fact, right? It happened, things in the past happened, we know them. History's fact, right? Well, the answer is whose fact? Really, from the perspective of the Indians, I've discovered Europeans. Why isn't that equally as true? And it is. Really, history in a nutshell is the story that we tell ourselves, about each other, and about the past. It's a systematic ordering and interpretation of the available facts from different points of view, different kinds of facts, to explain why things are the way they are, and how we got this way. Every group, every generation asks questions, new questions of the past to tell them about themselves. So in that way, history is in immediate dialogue with the present always. There is no absolute past. It is the story, the narrative we create ourselves based on a systematic interpretation of events. So what I want to do is three things today. I want to tell you a story, because that's what history is. A familiar story about Utah. Secondly, I'm going to turn that story around by asking different questions of the story you all know, and different cultural perspectives and a different set of evidence. And then third, I'm going to give you a quiz. I'm going to use that, and I'm going to use you to show you what history is and what history isn't. Okay? So be prepared. So the story. Well, I'm already behind on my Calvin and Hobbes. It's just the way we persuade ourselves that we can know anything. So the story is a familiar one. Mormon settlers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in July of 1847 through September, and about 1,600 overwintered that first winter here in the valley. It was a mild winter. They had plenty of food. They were well prepared. There was no threat of starvation. In fact, the weather was so mild that they were plowing all winter long. They plowed 1,000 acres in what was called the Big Field. But that mild weather comes back to haunt them, because in the spring they planted. They planted in March. You all know what happened when you plant your garden in March, right? It freezes, frost, absolutely. So they had two frosts. They planted 1,000 acres. They had two killing frosts. And then the other thing that mild winter did was it didn't cut down on the rodent population, which then infested their homes because they built in the middle of a field, right? Gruffers galore, and this is the Hilton, full of sacks of grain. The other thing it doesn't do is cut down on the larvae of insects. So, in May of 1848, swarms of crickets and grasshoppers descended on the valley, and they threatened to consume everything. Now, how many of you have ever seen Mormon crickets up close and personal? Okay, I'm gonna So Mormon crickets, here they are, about average size. I collected these a few years ago in the valley in northern Utah. The story goes, and we get from diaries, Mrs. Lorenzo Dow Young, May 27th, 1848. She says, quote, she writes, "Today, to our utter astonishment, the crickets came by millions, sweeping everything before them. They first attacked a patch of beans. For us, in 20 minutes, there was not a vestige to be seen. They next swept over peas and came into our garden, took everything clean. Took everything clean. The next day," she writes, quote, "Today the crickets have commenced on our corn and small grain. They've eaten off 12 acres for Brother Rosencrantz, 7 for Charles, and are now taking Edmonds." On June 4th, there's another wave of crickets, and John Steele explained in his diary how the frost had just occurred and had damaged the crops, and then, quote, "To help make the disaster complete, the crickets came by the thousands of tons." I want you to remember that phrase, the thousands of tons. Okay? Have you ever seen them move? Oh, you don't need to hear that. It's the Imperial Death March that's going on. This is essentially how they move across the landscape in these huge hordes. They're just kind of relentless. So, Colonel Thomas Kane described the crickets as, quote, "wingless, black, dumpy, swollen-headed, and bulging eyes in cases like goggles, mounted upon legs of spring wire and clock spring, and with the general appearance that justified the Mormons in comparing them to a cross between a spider and a buffalo." A cross between a spider. And these were big. These were big, bad bugs eating each other, because that's kind of what they do also in a endless search for protein and salt. But they were strong, fast, mean. And again, this is 20th century pictures, but in the 19th century, even in Kansas, settlers talked about how mean the grasshoppers are. They got the guy by the throat, stealing all of his food. His family have taken over his house. This is the kind of This is the kind of 19th century view that people had of them. So facing starvation, settlers in Salt Lake Valley battled the insects any way they could. They drug ropes across the top of the grain. They tried to sweep them up in nets. They drove them, tried to burn them with fire, everything that they could do. And all would have been lost, the story goes, had there not been a miracle, right? Seagulls. Seagulls descend, a supernatural phenomenon. They descend, they eat up crickets, they fly out to the Great Salt Lake, they do the Technicolor yawn, bulimic seagulls, and then they come back and eat more. That's the story. Primary sources for this. Got to go to the primary sources. John Smith on June 9th, 1848 writes, quote, "The first I knew of the gulls, I heard their sharp cry. Upon looking up, I beheld what appeared like a vast flock of pigeons coming from the northwest. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there must have been thousands of them. Their coming was like a great cloud, and when they passed between us and the sun, a shadow covered the field. I could see gulls settling for more than a mile around us." Yet John Smith, writing back to Brigham Young, because remember, Brigham Young doesn't spend the first winter here. He was smart. He went back to Iowa. John Smith reports back to Brigham, and he only mentions gulls as one of several things that helped save the crops. So the question becomes, what did people on the ground at that moment say? What did they see and perceive? Not writing in hindsight, but at the moment, so diary records. Brigham Madsen, one of the great Utah historians, did a survey of Utah diaries from this period, and he found that very few mentioned the gulls, or if they did, very briefly. It was just one of many things that was going on at the time. And none of them talked about it as a miracle. It just was. There were a number of cricket years and grasshopper years. Because what we're talking about here is two different insects, grasshoppers and crickets. If it flies and if they describe flight, that's a grasshopper. Crickets, as you've seen, have no wings. By the way, did you see some with spiky tails and some without? Do you want to sex those for me? I know this is the topic next week, but we'll start it here. With the spiky tails, that's got to be a woman. Absolutely, because that's what she uses to dig into the hard ground and plant her eggs. So it kind of, usually I get my students to jump at the other thing, obviously enough, right?
I'm not too old.
Yeah, don't admit that. So there are a number of plague years, 1848, 49, 55, and 56. And in each of those, Brigham Madsen, looking at diaries, found very little mention of seagulls at all. Jesse Crosby was pretty common. He reported, quote, God effectively removed the grasshoppers with a great wind, which swept them into the Great Salt Lake as they rose in the air of the middle of each day. The destruction was so great that rows of grasshoppers were seen along the shores of the lake for scores of miles. Thus was an army effectively removed, and the heavens seemed to smile upon us. So it's a wind that blows grasshoppers up, and they fall into the Great Salt Lake. Also remember that fact. John Butler Lowe, in 1855, reported immense piles of grasshoppers that had been washed up along the shores of the Great Salt Lake, lining the shores 2 feet thick in windrows of grasshoppers. So the miracle itself, so there's wind taking care of them, not gulls. But the miracle of the gulls really isn't talked about until 1880. It's in the memoirs and in hindsight, especially of Eliza Snow, Utah's poet, or Mormon's poet laureate, where she talks about this miracle that occurred. Yet you go back to Eliza Snow's diary, what she wrote at the moment, she doesn't mention it at all. Doesn't mention it at all. This is a miracle that's created in 1880 as the Mormons are coming under tremendous pressure from the federal government, the attack on polygamy, the attack on Mormon control of the state, and they need something. They need something to unify them and give them an identity. And so this miracle becomes that. By the way, how can you tell that they're Mormon crickets? It's subtle. You have to look at the name tags and then you get it. But we know why. We know that they're not Jack Mormon crickets. So. Hey, baby, do we go to the Y together? Bagley is about as good as they come. My jar. Who has my jar? The jar. Ooh, it's nice and warm too. Did you? Okay. Yeah. So I've told you the story. Now I want to talk about, raise another issue, the question of evidence. So let me tell the story just a little bit different way with a different evidence base, approaching it the way from the cultural perspective of American Indians, the Indians of the Great Basin, and especially Utes and Shoshones of northern Utah. And I'm going to suggest a second set of facts or ways of approaching this by asking different questions and change the story fundamentally. We alter then what really the miracle becomes. So biological, anthropological theory suggests that human behavior is driven by getting the most for the least. The most return of things or food for the least expenditure of energy. Kilocalories, it's a bit, if you spend more than you get, you go broke or you die in food. So that's what drives human nature. That is the ultimate evolutionary adaptation in a species, getting more for less. So Indians of the Great Basin are experts at this. One of the most difficult environments anywhere. Even the Arctic is easier in some ways because of the large mammals. In the basin, resources are thinly distributed across the landscape, and you've got to take a little bit of everything to get enough to live. And they were experts at this, and they used crickets. We know the Fremont Indians used crickets because we find it in their petrified coprolites, in their petrified feces. We know that they ate them. And Indians did all sorts of great things. They drove them into water sources where they would be washed up. They would drive them into ditches that they had filled with sagebrush. They would then light them on fire and roast them right on the spot. They would collect them, they would pound them into meal, add them with meat and berries, create a kind of desert fruit cake, or they would simply just gather these insects, dry them, especially if they'd washed up on the shores of a lake. They would dry them, already salted. They would simply take them, and crunch them down. Delicious. Crunchy, delicious desert lobster. You know, I'd share with you, but there's so few of them. I couldn't share with everybody then. Mormons knew this. Westward bound wagon trains and settlers had bought these fruitcakes and bought crushed insects from the Indians before. They had done it. Set that down there so I don't drop it, because I might have to do the Technicolor yawn and follow the Seagull Miracle. The settlers knew this. They bought this stuff. They called it desert fruitcake. Erastus Snow in 1880 gave a talk, and he said, quote, remembering back about this first experience with the Indians, he said, quote, "The savages had learned in their destitution to profit by these visitations, for when the insects would devour all green things, they would in turn devour the insects. And on this ground, on this city plot," and he's doing this in Temple Square, he says, "the first company of savages who visited the pioneer camp after the exchange of salutations retired to prepare their evening repast, and they emptied out of their sacks bushels of dried grasshoppers on which they made their supper." Snow then says, "Our people had not learned to do this yet, but had it not been for the providential appearance of the Gulls, we would have been brought to the same necessity, to gather up gather up crickets, dry and salt them to subsist upon." So, this super infestation of crickets, grasshoppers, seen from an Indian perspective, from a Ute or a Shoshone perspective, this is the miracle. This is the true miracle. The appearance of the Gulls is the appearance of a predator, a competitor, vying with them for this valuable natural resource. But if you take it one step further, even for the Mormons, the miracle was the crickets. Again, Brigham Madsen and his son David Madsen, who was the state archaeologist for many years, they decided to really test this theory in practice. They decided to see if it was a seagull or a cricket miracle. So what they did is they conducted field tests in the 1880s of gathering crickets. They found that the nutritional value, the positive ratio of calories obtained versus calories spent, was far superior to anything that the Mormons could have grown, any vegetal crop. Look at it this way. Lean beef, chicken, salmon, about 60% calories by protein. Pork, lamb, lobster, more fatty, less calories from protein. But sun-dried grasshoppers or crickets, about 60% calories by protein, 1% carbs, 2% fat by weight, 3,000 calories per kilogram, or about 1355 calories a pound. This is health food, ladies and gentlemen. This is good stuff. So the Madsons decided to conduct a test. What could they gather? What could happen that way? 5 tests. And they used these windrows of grasshoppers. Remember the pioneers that said that they'd been blown out into the lake and then they washed up in these 2-foot piles? Well, so they did that. And they experimented. They found 5 tests. They found that one person collecting grasshoppers or crickets from these windrows could gather anywhere between 41,000 and 714,000 calories per hour. The average of those 5 tests, 272,649 calories an hour. Think of that as 37 Wendy's bacon double cheeseburgers, 86 slices, Supreme Pizza, McDonald's #1 meal deals. You got your fries, your drink, your shakes. And Dairy Queen Super Chili Dogs, wow, 82 Kentucky Fried Chicken meal deals, 13 double Whoppers, 3 cases of beer, 1 case of Miller Lite, all of the caffeine-free Diet Coke you want, and that's important in Utah. Snickers bar, a pack of wintergreen lifesavers, because trust me, after eating the crickets, you need those lifesavers. 1 raw carrot, and there's still 1 calorie left over. Put more graphically. Yeah, all of those together. That all adds up to 272,000 calories, assuming a daily caloric intake of 2,500 calories. Now that's way above the recommended minimum, but we're hunter and gatherers. 2,500 calories, one person in 1 hour could feed 4 people for nearly a month. That is far in excess of anything you can grow in the gardens. And again, in Utah, given their size, this is even better. It's just not that hard. So, why not? Why did the Mormon pioneers not see the true miracle? Europeans don't eat bugs. What else don't we eat?
Lots of things.
Dogs and cats. The dog is delicious. Horses, sliced thin, served medium rare. Okay, so edibility is cultural. It's not biological. It's very much cultural. But again, we're even pushing that today. How many of you have seen the chupul bars? People are making a living, and it's eco-friendly, a lot less water to create this than beef. They're making essentially granola bars out of it. This is now a big business. So there's lots of things. So humans aren't simply driven by biology. We're driven by all sorts of things, our cultural definitions of what's edible or not. So in the lecture so far, what I'm trying not to say is what's true and what isn't. That these are 2 different interpretations or organizing of facts and evidence from 2 different cultural viewpoints. It's a demonstration that miracles are and natural resources are both culturally defined. It's also about making history more complex by reminding us we have to look at multiple stories of a similar event to come to an understanding of what's happening. We have to recognize and weigh this evidence. And even then, we would still fall short of fully representing what actually happened in the past. And now you're going to help me prove that. What did you see me do up here? What did you just witness? You were all sitting here in the same room. I just did something that made you go, I ate a cricket, didn't I? All of you agree? Anybody see me eat something else? I ate something. Now you're a doubter. So it wasn't a cricket. So all of these people are wrong. You don't know that. You know, you're hedging your bets now. Come on. Have guts. All of you, anybody disagree? Oh, come on. I've got 1 half doubter, that's it. All of you witnessed a fact, And I needed a doubter to make this really work, so I'm going to use you. One person doubts. One person maybe saw something a little bit different or is not certain. So really what you can see is, what is the history of this event? What really took place here? Did I really eat a cricket or didn't I? Or does that really even matter? Does it matter what you saw and what you're going to go home and tell somebody else you saw happen? That becomes the historic fact, which may or may not be true. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me. I wish you all a good Sunday. You know, that's kind of the point. It really doesn't matter what I did, what the truth of it is. It's what you believe I did. Yes?
How did they do that test when they...
The gathering? Yeah, they did it in, yeah. These events still happen, these super infestations, especially of grasshoppers. So they did tests, I believe they were in Nevada and in Utah, and they found lakes where these events happened. And so they went out and they just gathered and to come up with these kind of basic numbers. It's published. This event, I'm stealing freely from Dave and Brig Madsen. Brig was one of the kindest mentors, a historian. He's from a different generation, one of the great historians of the Shoshone people of northern Utah, and writing the injustice that was always talked about, the Battle of Bear River instead of the Bear River Massacre. But they published this. It's called One Man's Meat is Another Man's Poison, and it's published in the Nevada Historical Society Quarterly because they wouldn't publish in the Utah Historical Quarterly. Yes?
What year was this published?
It was published in 1987. David and Brigham Madsen. One man's meat is another man's poison. Mm-hmm.
So, I didn't quite gather that Mormons did eat crickets.
No, they never did. Not in large numbers. There were... Oh, desert fruitcake. Yeah, there were people who bought it on the Overland Trail, people going to Oregon or California. Mormons would have done it too, but in terms of eating it as a staple, No, their imperative was to get rid of the crickets and grasshoppers because what they wanted to eat was not the crickets. So never in any significant amount did they take advantage of that. Yes?
Can you talk more about why the story developed?
It develops over time. How do we develop stories ourselves? We tell ourselves that something miraculous happened. Mother Teresa's just been sainted or is in the process of being sainted. And that's pretty quick in human memory because we all remember, and a lot of people remember her. Not everybody agrees that she actually has 3 miracles or what those miracles are. If you take that another 2 generations, then doubt begins to disappear and the stories predominate, the stories that we want to hear and tell ourselves about our past. And especially if they reaffirm cultural values or what we want to believe about the present, what we need in the present world. We need that faith, we need that moment that proves that there is something other, something beyond, that reaffirms that we're okay. And that can be a religious item, that can be just a historical narrative about us as Americans and the story we tell about ourselves and our actions in the past that others wouldn't kind of see in the same light. Does that help get at it? And for the Mormons, that moment is when they're under their most intense scrutiny by the federal government, when they are under wholesale attack. The church is being disbanded, the passage of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, the Poland Act, Mormon migration. Mormons are not considered white, by the way, in the 19th century. They're considered colored and suspect, and so the racialized language leads to immigration restriction on the Mormons in the late 19th century and early 20th century that should resonate in this state, given the rhetoric that's going on in the present day. So it's a moment, it's a story that brings them all together. Most of the people who were there at that moment by 1880 are dead. So it's only a few people like Erastus Snow and Eliza Snow and others that then create and use this story for group cohesion, to give themselves an identity in the face of opposition. It's a very common human trope. Does that help answer your question or get at it? Yes?
I was just going to say, is this like the most important story that galvanized them at that time, or were there other
No.
more important factors, like how
Yeah.
significant is that as a factor?
You know, there are lots of stories they tell themselves at this moment. The stories about Brigham Young saying this is the right place to drive on. That comes out at this moment too. The same moment. Wilford Woodruff talks about it. In his diary, he doesn't have Brigham Young saying those exact words, but this is the right place to drive on is what we all know, right? That becomes instituted in history at that moment. There's all sorts of things going on in the late 1880s and 1890s. And then the church even shifts further in the 20th century when they abandon polygamy. They have to find new stories to tell themselves. Polygamy for 3 generations was the defining element that bound Mormons together, the opposition to it, the belief in it, the practice of it, especially its leaders. And then they give it up. So what do? They go back and they find new stories, and they turn back to the original stories of Joseph Smith and the meeting with angels in the Hill Cumorah and that first vision. That then becomes the thing that binds them together. They buy up property in upstate New York. They buy up the Smith property in Vermont. They start a travel, essentially a tourism industry to these holy sites and shrines to redirect the church away from cooperation, the communal collectivism that is polygamy too, and towards a new future where the church goes back to the original vision, not polygamy, which had given it identity for so many years. So these are the stories that we tell about Mormons. You can tell the same stories about Americans in general or any other national group. We tell ourselves different stories at different moments about our past to explain who we are today. Yeah. Bob, or your Mike?
This is the last question.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure it would be the best, but is there then, does your work encompass tracking, or you track the expansion of this version of events from the snows? Do they seem to be the genesis of all the other accounts?
Yeah, and again, I'm building on Brigg and David Madson's work on this. And so the stories then explode in the 20th century. And once you get the improvement era going, the improvement era, LDS kind of family church magazine, then that story is reprinted time and time again. And it becomes then very, very set as this miracle. It doesn't matter whether it's a miracle or not. It's what you believe in it, and then what it makes you feel and do, and how you belong to that group. That's what's really important. So that's why I want to make sure I'm really clear. I'm not saying it's not a miracle. I'm not saying it is. It doesn't really matter what I say. It's what people believe and bring to it.
Where are the dreams that we once had? Isn't it time to bring them back? What were the promises? Caught on the tips of our tongues.